The Australian Financial Review.
20 years ago this month, Andrew Forrest asked a small contingent of shareholders for their backing to set up Fortescue Metals Group.
Fortescue is the new force in iron ore.
Fortescue is now the country's 8th largest listed company, but Andrew Forrest is no longer its biggest shareholder. Corporate filings suggest that as of June 20, that mantle now belongs to Nicola Forrest.
So we did the math and we came to this incredible kind of revelation that Nicola Forrest owned more shares in Fortescue than Andrew. Nicola Forrest might be the new biggest shareholder in Fortescue.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, resources reporter Peter Kerr on the split in the Forrest empire, how it came to light, and what it means for the iron ore giant and its green energy plans. It's Thursday, July 27. Hi Pete, great to have you back on the podcast.
Great to be here with you.
This is an important Australian corporate story involving the fate of the largest shareholding in the country's 8th biggest listed company. But it's also very much a Perth story, and I know you're from Perth. Tell us about growing up there in a city with more than its fair share of billionaires. Where do the Forrests sit in terms of the corporate hierarchy?
For a modestly sized city, there's about 2 million people in Perth. The place massively bats above its average for wealth. When I was a kid, it was all about Alan Bond revolutionising Fremantle through the America's Cup.
Bond Corporation. The first America's Cup win is in the past. Now we're winning the present and planning the future.
There was the Holmes Courts trying to privatise BHP, if you can believe that.
It's perfectly serious. The only thing that's unusual, really, if one looks at it, is the relative size.
You've got Kerry Stokes.
The West has always been an important newspaper. Western Australia's my home. I love Western Australia. I love everything about it.
Who owns most of Channel 7 and the local newspaper and big truck companies. Chris Ellison in mining, Angela Bennett, the heiress, and then Gina Reinhardt, who has this perennial spot seemingly at the top of the AFR rich list.
While I have many investment opportunities in a globalised economy,
with all her mining and pastoral interests,
the place where I most want to create sustainable jobs is Australia.
The Forrests have typically come in at number 2.
The green hydrogen market could generate revenues at the very least of $12 trillion a year by 2050, bigger than any industry we have today.
The thing that sets the Forrests apart from all those other billionaires in Perth is that most of them don't like to be in the media. I mean, Chris Ellison, until a couple of years ago, we only had one photo of him in our files. We couldn't get pics of the guy. Whereas the Forrests have been the polar opposite. It has really seemed like Andrew loves the stage, loves the spotlight, and so wealth on a scale that the Forrests have is hard not to notice. If you're starting in the city, the Fortescue buildings down there on Adelaide Terrace in East Perth, drive along the river in a westerly direction towards the coast. In 5 minutes' time, you'll go past the beautiful Old Swan Brewery building. That's now the Forrest private family empire full of Tatarang and their charitable work and all their other private ventures. Keep driving west on Stirling Highway. You'll eventually get to Cottesloe Beach, Perth's most famous beach, the one that's in the postcards, and the building that's in the postcards is the Indiana Tea Rooms. The Forrests are currently doing a major redevelopment of that. Keep going south, you'll get into dairy country around Harvey. The Forrests have a huge footprint there. It's pretty hard to avoid their influence in WA.
Pete, it's not just the landmarks and the businesses they own in WA, but Andrew Forrest has really been the talk of the country over the past year. With the new direction he's taking Fortescue in and his move into green energy, which was the subject of the last podcast episode when you joined us. You described him then as one of the greatest salesmen this country has ever seen. What has he been up to over the past year?
You're right that Fortescue has continued headlong into this rush into clean energy products. Since we last spoke, they've completed construction of a factory near Gladstone, which will make the electrolyzers that make hydrogen. Just last week, they bought a undeveloped hydrogen project on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. They're promising to have 5 hydrogen projects go to final investment decision before Christmas. So that whole strategic pivot of Fortescue, which has been pretty spectacular from a corporate perspective, that has continued apace. But I'd say that this year there's been a little bit of a reality check in that there's been a big corporate reorganisation. Hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of jobs have gone at Fortescue, which has sort of been this process of just trying to tame perhaps the excesses of the previous 3 years, where famously Andrew and his team went flying around the world, signing up all these different deals with governments in Africa or PNG for clean energy projects. I think this year has been a year of sorting the wheat from the chaff a little bit and determining which of those actually have potential to become a business and which of them will go on the back burner. So while Fortescue's going through this sort of reality check process of trying to look at what was gathered in those amazing 2 or 3 years of globetrotting, Andrew's still Andrew. He's still out there doing it.
West Australian mining magnate Andrew Forrest has spent an hour at the White House with President Joe Biden.
I mean, just 2 weeks ago on a Monday morning, he had a meeting with Joe Biden and the King at the same time.
He is an action man, and he sees in us real action. He sees in us a solution through green hydrogen to global warming, one which can drive employment, drive investment, and drive down global warming.
I don't know about you, Lisa, but my Monday mornings, I try to ease into them a bit, like Joe Biden and the King.
Yeah, I haven't had that sort of lineup for quite some time. So with this sort of profile, his private life has also come under scrutiny. And that brings us to the story that you and Brad Thompson broke a few weeks ago. Tell us how you came to be looking at the complex financial holdings of the Forrest empire.
Yeah, I guess famous people have rumours circulating about them all the time. And as reporters, you hear them and 99.9% of them you discard. The Forrests camp, I mean, the rumours around Andrew Forrest had been non-stop, and you constantly had people saying a wide range of things. And I guess the tamest and most consistent rumour that had been floating around in the past year or two was that Andrew and Nicola, after close to 30 years of marriage, had started to lead separate lives. Now, my colleague in Perth, Brad Thompson, who I work with really closely on most things, he and I were both hearing this a lot, and neither of us had any interest to go diving into their personal lives, but we knew that there would be a significant corporate story, potentially, if the rumours were true about a separation. So for probably a year, we've been keeping a close eye on this, and I guess we've had 2 lines of inquiry open for a long time, one of which is talking to humans, of course, and people we know and gathering information. But the other is more of a quantitative thing, looking at all the corporate records, who owns what, who's moving what between what. And that turned out to be quite important. So back in February, we noticed a couple of things that weren't really strong enough to warrant a story, but definitely piqued our interest, and we put away in our pocket, knowing that they might be useful one day. So we spotted this little-known Forrest family company called LLN Log Cabins Proprietary Limited. To this day, I still do not know what that company does. If one of your listeners does, please be in touch. But we noticed that the ownership of that had moved from half Andrew, half Nicola to being wholly Nicola. Now, that in its own right was not a smoking gun, because within the Forrest family empire, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of companies. So we kept noticing a couple of little things like that. We kept putting them away in our pocket. But then in late June, the Forrests announced that they were transferring $5 billion worth of their Fortescue shares to the charity that they control, the Minderoo Foundation. And I guess watching that happen is where Brad and I really felt like there must be more to that story. the sort of reorganisation that was going to take, it just sounded like the kind of thing you would do if the rumours of a separation were true. We knew it was time to really prioritise this story and look deeper into it. And so, as I mentioned earlier, that meant talking to as many people as we could to try and get those sort of human-type pieces of information. But it also meant really doubling down on those deep dives into the corporate structure, going right down into the ASIC filings and seeing exactly who owned what and when they owned it. So as part of that late June announcement about the shares being transferred to the charity, the Forrests had to make a number of substantial shareholder disclosures to the ASX. If you own more than 5% of a company, you have to make a filing that says the shares have changed, they're being held this way. And your listeners can go back and look at those filings from June 22. They clearly state the Forrest family companies and how many shares those particular companies hold. So, looking through those, notice a new name, Coaxial Ventures. And we did a deep dive into that company, and it turns out it was wholly and solely owned by Nicola Forrest. Yet this company, which had only been created in that same week of late June, suddenly, according to the ASX filing, was holding 50 million Fortescue shares worth about 1.1 billion at that time.
That's quite a big holding for a company that we hadn't heard of before.
That's right. So I think that's the moment that Brad and I thought, at the very least, there is a business story here in that Nicola Forrest, for some reason, has created a brand new company, and the address of that brand new company was not the beautiful Old Swan Brewery building in Perth, where most Forrest companies are addressed to. This company, Coaxial, was addressed to a luxury property in Point Piper in the wealthy suburbs of Sydney. And Andrew was not listed as a director. He was not listed as a secretary. He was not involved in this company at all, as far as we could see. So it dawned on us that most of the Forrest family shares were owned by entities in which Andrew and Nicola had an equal shareholding. And yet here was this company where Nicola seemed to own 50 million shares in her own right. So we did the math and we came to this incredible kind of revelation that Nicola Forrest owned more shares in Fortescue than Andrew. Nicola Forrest might be the new biggest shareholder in Fortescue. Now, this month marks 20 years since Andrew Forrest became a director of Fortescue, and he has personified it. He has been its CEO, its chairman, its executive chairman, its biggest shareholder, its absolute talisman. You know, Andrew Forrest not being the biggest shareholder of Fortescue is like In Excess without Michael Hutchence. It's kind of unthinkable. And that's when Brad and I knew we really had a story to write here, and we just weren't sure how big it was going to get.
So you've got this information, Pete. What do you do with it?
So we thought really hard about how we would put this inquiry into the Forrest empire. So we formulated 6 very data-driven questions. We didn't launch straight into, are you separating? We just asked, do you disagree with the analysis that Nicola is now the biggest shareholder in Fortescue? And several other questions of that nature. And I think we knew that if we confined the conversation to those things, the Forrests kind of had to answer it because there would be a stock market response. You know, if Andrew Forrest is no longer the biggest shareholder in Fortescue, well, the stock market might like to know about that and might trade in a certain way. And to be clear, Andrew and Nicola are considered associates under the law, and so they had not done anything wrong in the way that they had presented the information to the stock market. But we felt like there was more to the story. So we put these questions in a very data-driven way. We fired them off. It was in the evening, shortly before 7 p.m. The next day, Brad and I are sitting around like cats on a hot tin roof waiting for this response. And we spent most of that day, I guess, working out what we were going to write if we got no response from the Forrests, if they literally just said no comment. And so we were really surprised when that afternoon what came back to us was not data answers to match the questions we'd asked, but a 3-sentence statement written directly by Andrew and Nicola Forrest.
So, Pete, you've done your deep dive into the ASIC filings. You've discovered that Nicola Forrest is the largest shareholder in Fortescue. You sent off the questions, sleepless night, and then you get a response, a personal response from Andrew and Nicola Forrest. What did it say?
The response kind of cut to the chase. It didn't bother with all of our pointy-headed, data-driven questions. It was a statement from Andrew Forrest and Nicola Forrest, and it said, "After 31 years of marriage, we have made the decision to live apart. Our friendship and commitment to our family remain strong. There's no impact on the operations, control or direction of Fortescue, Minderoo or Tatarang. We will continue our shared mission to create and gift our wealth to tackle community and global challenges, as recently shown by last month's donation of 1/5 of our Fortescue shareholding to the Minderoo Foundation." It's safe to say that Brad and I nearly fell off our seats when we received that.
And so you published the story online that day. And what was the response like to the story?
Yeah, we published the story in the evening, close to 8 o'clock Melbourne and Sydney time.
The Forrests have splintered. Australia's wealthiest couple, Andrew and Nicola Forrest, announcing they've made the decision to live apart, not divorce.
The media reaction was instant, like the story instantly travelled.
The pair reiterated their family commitment in a statement while insisting there will be no impact on shared ventures, including Fortescue Metals Group.
And we kind of knew it was going to be bigger than Texas for a couple of days.
It's pretty much the equivalent of the Bill and Melinda Gates of Australia.
And then the next morning we were kind of wondering, well, how are Fortescue shares going to trade? Because not only was there the sort of main aspect to this story that the Forrests were separating, but us as business journos had also made a point in our story of pointing out that Nicola arguably controlled more shares in Fortescue than Andrew. So we wondered, would the shares drop on that?
For now, the market isn't spooked. Fortescue opening 3.9% up after their marriage went south.
Turns out they rose a little bit. I mean, in truth, you'd probably say the shares were largely unchanged that day, but they drifted ever so slightly higher. The iron ore price was up that day and other iron ore miners rose more, so you might say they underperformed. But I think the only fair conclusion is to say the market shrugged its shoulders and assumed everything was going to be all right. Maybe investors felt like this was just confirmation of something they'd known or suspected for a long time.
So, Pete, as it turns out, investors are relatively comfortable with what the separation means for the future of Fortescue and Fortescue shares. But isn't it fair to say that there's a big question mark over that stock that is now controlled by Nicola? And can you explain why this was an important story to write? Because I imagine you don't usually spend a lot of time covering people's private lives in your reporting day. So why was this story an important one to write?
You're dead right, and frankly, both Brad and I would prefer not to write about people's private lives because it's very difficult to do. There are instances like this where a marriage is a very important thing. It's the apex of big corporate structures. And so that was the case with the Forrests. I mean, Fortescue is the 8th biggest company on the Australian Stock Exchange by market capitalisation. The Forrests control 36% of it. So if you're an investor or a day trader, if suddenly half of that 36%, if, roughly 18% of the company might be up for sale, that's an enormous event. Now, we should stress that the Forrests say it's not up for sale, and Andrew and Nicola's joint statements make clear that that's not the case, and there really shouldn't be much change. But it's only a couple of years ago that there was a divorce in the marriage that was central to Magellan, the funds manager. So Hamish Douglas, he and his wife divorced, and around that time, assurances were given that there was absolutely no way that this would lead to a big sell down in shares in Magellan. They controlled, I think, circa 12% of the company at that time. It was only 11 months later when big chunks of Magellan shares were being sold by the Douglases. So I think, we take Andrew and Nicola on their word in their statement, and we assume that that is their absolute honest intent. But we also know things can change. And by the way, it's playing out again this week with Mike Cannon-Brookes and his partner after the revelations over the weekend that they're pursuing a separation. What does that mean for the big shareholding in Atlassian that Mike Cannon-Brookes has? These are legitimate matters of public interest that journalists should and will explore.
And what sort of response did you get after the story came out?
Since we published the story, interestingly, the most common type of feedback I've received is, what took you guys so long? Which is interesting, right? Because this is not a divorce. This is an announcement of separation. Ultimately, only the two people in a marriage can say when they've chosen to separate. And that's why no matter how frequently Andrew Forrest seemed to be overseas, no matter what rumours we heard, that's why we weren't going to write that they were separated until Andrew and Nicola said themselves, we are separated. And we should probably add that we gather at this time that there are no plans for an immediate divorce within the Forrest empire.
So what happens now with the Forrests? What does this mean for Twiggy and his green energy dreams, and what does it mean for the future of Fortescue?
In the short term, it doesn't look like it means a hell of a lot for Fortescue. Fortescue shares are pretty good dividend payers. So many investors that I've spoken to suspect that Nicola will have the same incentives that they do and that Andrew does for Fortescue to thrive. The 50 million Fortescue shares that she now controls in Coaxial Ventures, that's going to be a pretty handy dividend stream. So default setting is that I don't think it's going to change much in the near term. The trucks in the Pilbara keep driving around, the trains keep carrying that iron ore to the port, and the boats, one of which is called Nicola, I might add, will keep leaving the port and taking that stuff to China. So I think Fortescue's at a point where even before this became public, Andrew Forrest was expected to take a slight step back in his public appearances for Fortescue, simply because a leadership turnover now seems to have been resolved for the time being. Fortescue now has its new chief executive of the mining side, Fiona Hick, appointed and in place. Its CEO of the clean energy division, Mark Hutchison, he's been in that gig for getting close to a year now. So this past year or 18 months where Andrew Forrest has been appearing on earnings calls and quarterly calls, we'd been getting the vibe for a few months now that was probably not going to continue. He was probably going to let the executives handle that a bit from now on. And, when Andrew's on these calls, Andrew is the personification of a thing that is at the heart of WA culture. WA has this blue sky, anything's possible, if you dream it, you can make it kind of culture. He's trying to take Fortescue from being an iron ore miner that had essentially become a yield stock for investors. It was just a reliable dividend payer like Commonwealth Bank in the past few years. He's trying to take it back out into that visionary growth space by going into these opaque new industries like green hydrogen.
And he did get the budget win with the $2 billion hydrogen fund.
That's right. He and the sector seem to have had a win there. That's good for the sector, but over in the US, it is a drop in the ocean compared to what Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is throwing at green hydrogen projects. The Fortescue team think that if they build a green hydrogen project in the States in certain spots and they hire the right number of apprentices to satisfy the fine detail of the act, they might get close to half of the cost covered by Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. So governments are really starting to throw money behind hydrogen in multiple jurisdictions. And they've also had a win through lawmakers in Europe where they got the definition of green hydrogen legislated. So, people talk about brown hydrogen, a grey hydrogen, a blue hydrogen, and there's sort of traditionally been unspecified terms that anyone can sort of claim. But Europe is now going through this process after being heavily lobbied by forest and forest-related entities to set a definition, and that is a big win. It means that in time it's going to be easier to get premium pricing for those sorts of things.
And finally, Pete, is this a chance for Nicola to step out of Andrew's shadow? She's now the 8th richest person in the country, 2 places above Andrew. What do you think is on the cards for her? And is this also the time for the Forrest children to become part of the story? Who are they, and will we be hearing more from them?
They are a fascinating part of this because they're not really children anymore. The oldest, Grace, she turns 30 this week, if the corporate records of her date of birth are correct, and I trust they are. What we know of Grace, which is not much, I've never met her, but we know that she is an activist for human rights and environmental work and seems very engaged in the Forrests charity work. The second child, Sophia, is an actress and is sort of making good headway in that field. She starred in a Tally movie which came out last year about the Bali bombings. I recommend it to you, Lisa. I enjoyed it. Sophia Forrest did a really good job. So she's coming through. And we know that the Forrest family, among their maze of companies, is some production companies, Minderoo Pictures. So is Sophia Forrest going to emerge as a big player in the arts and dramatic scene in Australia? And then the youngest, Sydney, he is 23 this year. And we don't know much about him, but we can see that he, like his sisters, has been setting up ASIC-registered companies in the past couple of years, multiple of them. So I don't know about you, Lisa. When I was 23, I was not a director of an ASIC-registered company. So these kids are clearly plugged in, they're clearly engaged, and they clearly have their own plans for their future. And I guess all we can do is wait to see what they are.
And Nicola?
I sense that Nicola has been willing to step out in her own right a little bit more for a couple of years. You might recall, Lisa, that it was probably 18 months ago, there was an episode of Australian Story about her.
It honestly feels a little bit surreal, in as much as that I don't feel myself as a billionaire that I'm any different in my attitudes.
And it profiled a lot of the work she was doing, and at the time a lot of it was about mentoring young women trying to come through in either the business sector or the political sector.
People can criticise how money is made and how it's given away. And I would actually say that our eldest daughter, Grace, has always said, you know, philanthropy can look like a dirty thing because if people have made money in a bad way, then it's their excuse to make themselves feel better by giving it away. I do not see us in that camp at all.
And we know that Nicola has been an active participant not only in the Forrest family's charitable work, but in the business interests. You know, she's the one who seems to be passionate about a lot of the property development projects. We gather that Nicola is also closer to the R.M. Williams investment. So she's got those business interests. But we've also seen her step into public life a bit in the past few years. Ahead of the last federal election, she set up this group called Women for Progress. You know, Julie Bishop and Lucy Turnbull, the wife of former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, were both involved in that too. It's a group that tries to mentor young women coming through. And we also know that Nicola has helped drive the Forrest family's interest in companies led by women, like the fashion label Camilla. So she doesn't look like the kind of person who's just going to sit back and enjoy a big dividend stream and eat cucumber sandwiches.
No, it doesn't. So all eyes on Nicola and the next generation. Thanks, Pete. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week. The Reserve Bank will feel less pressure to lift interest rates at next week's meeting after headline inflation fell to a weaker than expected 6% in the June quarter. The soft inflation figures, down from 7% in March, show price pressures have eased across key consumer goods such as furniture, appliances and clothes. However, prices in the labour-intensive services sector are still rising rapidly, and an acute shortage of properties has resulted in the fastest pace of rent inflation since 2009. And China's missing Foreign Minister Qin Gang has been replaced in what some are calling a political purge of one of President Xi Jinping's closest aides. Beijing announced that former Foreign Minister Wang Yi would take over from Mr. Qin, who has not been seen in public for a month. The Chinese government did not give a reason for the abrupt senior leadership change. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray with Peter Kerr reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the podcast and want to hear more, consider sharing it or writing a review as it helps us reach more people. And follow wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.